This is Guns Unpacked, a podcast where we interrogate, engage, and elevate the terms of the gun debate as we know it. I am your host, Jennifer Carlson, director of the Center for the Study of Guns in Society at Arizona State University. I am excited today to welcome Dr. Kendell Coker, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Connecticut College. He is a clinical psychologist with a specialization in forensic psychology and also an attorney. His primary research interests include the study of trauma, substance use, juvenile delinquency, and aggression and violence, such as community violence, interpersonal conflict, and group conflict. He frequently speaks about the various forms of trauma and the different ways we are impacted by it. Kendell's research also explores racial and health-related disparities in the criminal justice system and the contributing impact of systematic bias and discrimination. He works with state officials, nonprofit organizations, and local stakeholders to develop policies that can mitigate the harms of gun violence. So welcome, Kendell.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So you study guns as part of a much broader interest in mental health, juvenile justice, and racial disparities. And so I'm curious how the focus on gun violence came about. Did you always know that you were eventually going to come to study gun violence? Can you tell us about your trajectory coming into this area of research?
Actually, it was guided in part by personal experience. I grew up in what we refer to as the housing projects in Brooklyn, New York. And I have a lot of positive, wonderful memories of growing up. And I remember as a kid, they used to have like the block parties and all of these fun community events. But also I was exposed and witnessed a good amount of gun violence as well. I think at some point, interestingly enough, the only two professions I said I would never go into was psychology and law. And so I tend to say if you're lucky, a career chooses you. I began primarily looking at juvenile delinquency and was training in like forensic hospitals. So a lot of my work initially was in correctional settings, actually. And I started to feel as if I was doing more late intervention work as opposed to prevention work. So then I started slotting a lot of my efforts into doing more community based work to keep people from going into the justice system, and then started working with them when they got out of the justice system. There was a very interesting moment actually in my life. I was actually at home, back home in Brooklyn, and my cousin was gunned down actually right in front of my window. And I remember the sense of pain that I felt. But I remember actually at his funeral, as people were talking, they say, none of you should feel like this is your fault. You all did all that you could. And I remember I became inconsolable. And the reason why was because I remember thinking, I study violence. I work with people who end up being victims of violence. I end up working with people who've been perpetrators of violence, and I couldn't save my own cousin. And I think at that point, there was this feeling where I became both disillusioned by the mental health and research field, while also maybe sparking a different level of passion that drove me into it. Little side note, the same person who called me to let me know that my cousin was the one who just got killed, he was gunned down 3 years later in my community. And so it just strengthened my passion to do this work, both as a researcher, as a practitioner, and as just a community member as well.
Thank you so much for sharing all that. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you was sort of a general question of like, what advice do you have for scholars looking to start work in this area? And I think you obviously hit on something so profound, which is that a lot of scholars who are engaged in the study of gun violence are coming with their own personal experiences of trauma. And then they're also being exposed to that trauma as a result of just doing the work, certainly the kind of work that you do. And as a researcher and as someone who has lived this and has someone who is exposed to it through the course of your research, what do you do to manage that primary and secondary trauma that you're experiencing?
That's a lot to unpack. That's a really great question. As it relates to fellow scholars, I think one thing I really feel strongly about is that it should be for the benefit of the community. sometimes have this identity crisis where I'm a member of the very academy that sometimes I loathe a little bit, in that we work for institutions who do research on communities, and I intentionally say the word on, when in fact it should really be with and for the communities instead. For any scholar that's doing work with communities where there is suffering and pain and trauma, their interest should come before the university's interest or the academic institution's interest. And that I stand by through and through to my core. As it relates to how I handle and deal with it, I try to do a lot of self-care. And what's interesting about even the whole self-care discussion is that we live in a society that we get mixed messages about self-care. People say, well, go on vacation, but then there's more work for you when you come back from vacation.
Yeah, but check your email the entire time you're on vacation and be super available.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I really try to do things that's good for my emotional wellness, including spending time with, for me, it's spending time with my family. It's watching college basketball. It's going to March Madness. It's watching movies. Whatever you can do to find time where you can sit in your peace, I think that's important, because that can also keep you going and hopefully keep you from getting burnt out.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I want to kind of shift into your scholarship, and I want to start by just sort of mapping the terrain, because I think there is, despite the fact that gun violence is in the news, we talk about it, we talk about gun politics, usually we just talk at a very superficial level. We don't get very deep. And there's really, despite just how impactful this issue is, there's a lot of lack of knowledge, misunderstanding about, what this terrain of gun violence even is all about. And so when you think about the relationship between race, gun violence, and gun trauma, what are the key facts that you wish everybody knew and understood? What would be at the top of your list?
I think there's a few things. One, sometimes the conversation around mental health and gun violence gets a little conflated, where people are saying, oh, we need more mental health services to help address the gun violence issue. And then I kind of want to remind people that it's not mental health issues such as trauma that leads to gun violence. One of the side effects of gun violence is trauma, right? So when you're exposed to a lot of gun violence, that's where you see the trauma happen. I think that discussion needs to be stated much more clearly when we're talking about trauma in these communities. The other thing is, I think we need to do a better job with humanizing data, because I go to conferences and people will show the number of fatalities. They'll say, well, we've had about 200 homicides, gun violence, firearm homicides in a particular community. And somehow after they give those numbers, we just kind of move on, right?
Yeah, people kind of glaze over because the numbers are so overwhelming.
Exactly. But the other thing too is that there's a story behind those numbers. So when we look at a number and we see 200 people, actually, you know what? I'll just say one. I like to use the analogy of a water droplet hitting a pond. And what happens when a water droplet hits a pond? It ripples out. And I think that's an important analogy for us to use when we think about gun violence, because for every homicide, think about how many people was affected by that homicide. Think about how many people knew that person, how many loved ones were affected by that loss, how many kids in school, how many people witnessed it. So you have the effect ripples out far further than the drop itself. And so I think we should pay attention to every drop, but also thinking about how far that's also affecting people as well in communities.
And I want to unpack this word trauma, because, it's kind of, trauma has almost become like the word anxiety, where people are like, I'm anxious, I'm having a panic attack. And it's used in a very sort of superficial way. And I think sometimes trauma is also used in that way. It conjures up, though, a lot of different things for different people. It looks different. It unfolds differently in different communities, especially in communities with concentrated disadvantage. And so can you give us a sense of what trauma looks like in the context of gun violence concretely? How does it take shape at an individual, a family, a community level?
Well, at an individual level, again, as you accurately pointed out, it affects everybody differently. When you're chronically exposed to it, I like to think of Bronfenbrenner, right? How systems interact with one another. When you're chronically exposed to some extent, you also have to figure out how to continue to survive. And so when people ask the question, we notice that a lot of the kids sometimes in these communities don't have PTSD. Why? And it's like, well, they have a lot of trauma symptoms, maybe, but they don't always rise to the level of having full blown post traumatic stress disorder. And that's really a reflection of what happens with how we diagnose people, right? It's a threshold system. So perhaps you have to hit, let's say, 5 or 6 symptoms in order to get the diagnosis. Well, if you're in survival mode, then yes, maybe you are having nightmares. Maybe you are a little bit jumpy, which are all symptoms of trauma. Maybe you are a little bit more on guard and a little more hypervigilant because you know that danger lurks almost anywhere. But at the same time, there's the risk of this being normalized, again, because you have to survive. And the example that I'll use, let's say for me, for instance, when I would get up and have to go to school, let's say someone was shot in my community, which did happen. I still have to be able to get up and walk out that door and go to school. So if I get too caught up in my pain and my anxiety and my fear, then it makes it hard to function. That also has consequences for me, for the community. It takes a toll on you. And again, it looks differently in different people. But for communities that are chronically exposed, it becomes somewhat of a survival function that kicks in. So you can go to work every day. You can go to school every day. And so as a result, some of these communities are carrying a lot more pain and a lot more of that trauma. But it's almost as if we have to learn to kind of suck it up in order to do what we need to do, because our communities are also under-resourced. So all of these problems feed into each other.
Yeah, and I super appreciated your comment earlier that when we're thinking about mental health and gun violence, we often have the causal relationship backwards. That it's, we talk about mental health causing gun violence, but actually it's gun violence that is making mental health crises, fester. It's enabling mental health crises and mental illness and all of these things. And so, across your research, you've written about what you call traumatic stress, social problem solving, emotional dysregulation, moral disengagement, lots of psychological terms. But really what you're trying to do is understand how traumatic stress impacts people differently. Your focus has been on African American youth. And so, I wanted to just hear how you conceptualize how your research informs what I think is, often stated as a truism, this idea that hurt people hurt people. How do you conceptualize the cycle of trauma?
Well, for one, I typically will use the analogy of someone who's walking, let's say, in a forest, right? So if you're walking in a forest and you at first may have no reason to be afraid, and then something comes out and it attacks you, right? Maybe something that didn't make you afraid before now makes you afraid. Then you keep walking through the forest and then something else comes out. And maybe it doesn't even attack you. Maybe nothing happens, but now you're a little bit more jumpy and a little bit more guard. And if you hear me making these like sounds, I'm actually kind of acting this out. So hopefully it's not distracting in any way. But then what happens is after a while, the world starts to be a dangerous place. You start to perceive it as a dangerous place. So the next time maybe a little fluffy animal walks up to you, instead of walking up to it and calmly petting it, now you may actually be the one who lashes out a little bit, because what do you do with all of that fear now? What do you do now when you think you're in danger? So it's not necessarily that you become a dangerous person. You're just now operating in a world where you know that harm is always lurking. And even people who may not be a threat to harm you, you might be a little bit more vigilant and maybe a little bit more reactive, because the world has now taught you that this is not a safe place for you. And so that's kind of that cyclical process that starts to happen. You're afraid. You go into survival mode. You're worried about things harming you. You're worried about people harming you. And think about it. If you've been hurt enough, sometimes what do you do with that pain? What do you do with that anger? And then on top of it, systems have also told you that you're not even as important as other people. So if you're seeing something happen to someone else in the forest and all of these resources become available to try to save that person, and you look around and you say, how come everybody that kind of looks like me is not getting the same kind of help? I've seen this fear in this jungle or this forest or whatever it is that we want to call it, right? We could call it the city, wherever, no matter what kind of landscape you use, the analogy is still the same. But you become fearful, and then you also don't get the same help when you are harmed as other people, particularly when they look like you. So now what do you do?
Yeah, and I think that's such a powerful way to frame trauma. Just listening to that, it gets at this, really fundamental aspect of trauma, which is that it's not just a bad experience, a hard experience, a challenge, a barrier. It fundamentally erodes your sense of reality and how you move through the world. And so I think that's just that. Thank you, because I think that's just so important to keep front and center in terms of how it just fundamentally erodes your basic everyday interactions. And so I wanted to actually ask you about the criminal justice system, because I think it's, your background is so interesting in terms of your background as an attorney, your background as a psychologist. And, I think that there are obviously a lot of fields that look at guns in society, look at gun violence, but, public health is one of the dominant fields. And historically, it hasn't had really a robust critique of the criminal justice system in terms of the harms that the criminal justice system can cause. If anything, public health has often viewed the criminal justice system really as like a potential collaborator, one arm of the state that can, actually implement interventions with respect to gun violence. But I've seen that change in recent years, especially as the Black Lives Matter movement and other related movements have really compelled scholars, practitioners, policymakers to really see how the trauma of gun violence is intertwined with the harms of the criminal justice system. So I'm curious, how you've experienced that tension in your work, both, as a practitioner, as a scholar, and where you see that conversation moving forward.
Well, I think there's a very important conversation to be had around policy as it relates to what happens also to people when they're returning into the community from criminal justice settings. One of which has been a big discussion has to do with Medicaid termination versus suspension. Well, when you're incarcerated, right, they terminate your Medicaid, and then when you're returning into the community, there's supposed to be some mechanism, and again, this can vary from state to state, but to reinstitute it. So then when they go back into the community, they are now covered when they go back into the community. That system is not always smooth. And think about the implication that that has with regards to healthcare access. It's hard enough for people to just get medical treatment. When you're thinking about access and also mental health treatment as well, you now have this on top of it. One battle that needs to be fought is making sure that when people are returning into the community, that they have access to coverage, because that's the gate in which people can get more care. Again, assuming that we maintain legislation, or at least on a federal and on a state level, ideally, that covers people for mental health treatment in a way that's equitable to medical. And that's not even perfect, right? But that's the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act. I might be a little bit off with the order of those words, but that's one issue I think is something that we really need to have dialogue about. But then on top of it, when we think about sometimes how gun violence can be related to people trying to fulfill their basic human needs, and that's a whole nother discussion, because we typically see higher rates of gun violence in communities where there's discrimination, there's poorer access to jobs, there's poorer access to other types of basic needs. When you get out, if we continue to have laws that make it difficult for people to find jobs to sustain themselves, then what, right? It becomes another cycle of victimization and leads to additional frustration. But that's also sometimes rooted in laws that will keep people from getting certain types of licenses in order to get certain types of employment. Housing is also a barrier because you have laws in certain places, particularly at states, for people can't live into lower income housing if they also have felony convictions. The same risk factors that are present before they go in are now present when they get out. So even if we believe in the argument of rehabilitation, which we've long abandoned anyway in our criminal justice system, because there's nothing rehabilitative about how we incarcerate people, we don't create a system through law or through resources that reduce the risk of people being risky towards other people because they can't have their basic needs met, which again, housing, food, shelter, right? With sheltered housing, I guess, the same thing. That is kind of the biggest systems issue that we should be talking about to help people who are at risk, even when they're going back into the community.
So I want to come back to this question of what gun policy looks like if it is reframed around the issue of basic survival. But I first want to go back to what you said about access to mental health care and how crucial that is. And also what you said a few minutes ago about, mental health in the conversation about gun violence is often, well, you didn't say this, but you kind of suggested it, that it's often not a good faith conversation, right? It's, people talk about mental health and it's often a way to shut down the conversation, not to actually open a deep, engaged, rich, granular conversation about how mental health is actually intertwined with gun violence. And so one of the things that I found really compelling about the research that you do is that you do really clearly say we need to be talking about mental health, but we need to be talking about it a little differently. And so I'm just curious, how do you walk that line in terms of really centering this issue without having it be sort of appropriated into this debate that basically uses mental health, again, as a way to shut down a conversation rather than have one?
Well, for one, I always, almost always, reiterate the point that trauma is the result of gun violence. I mean, we also cannot escape the reality that when you look across the globe, depression, anxiety, trauma, all of these symptoms and these disorders exist across the world. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, to which we diagnose people with mental health issues, is global. But what isn't is gun violence, right? What isn't is gun violence. So clearly, mental health is not what drives the gun violence, because if it was, then people will be shooting people all over the world. And that's not what we see. That obviously ties into the access issue. But I always make that point to kind of show that it's not really purely about mental health. It's also about literally guns. The other thing is that when we make the conversation tying mental health to gun violence, it also stigmatizes mental health. Sometimes even when I'm working with clients or talking to people in the community, people will sometimes say, yeah, I thought about talking to somebody, but it doesn't rise to the level of me going to shoot up a bunch of people. And I'm like, if you really think what they're communicating with that statement, right? They're communicating that people who have those issues are the ones who seek treatment, right? When in fact, those are not the same things, right? And so I try to really let people know that it doesn't rise to that level before you need to talk to somebody.
Yeah. And, one of the major developments that I've seen with respect to gun violence and racial disparities is not just the widening racial disparity in terms of gun crime, but also the closing, and this is based somewhat on preliminary data, the closing of the racial gap between white and Black Americans when it comes to gun suicide. And so while these data are still preliminary, my understanding is that the rate of gun suicide among Black Americans may have actually surpassed that of white Americans for the first time in 2022. So how does your research illuminate these very troubling trends?
I was actually just having a conversation with some people about this as it relates to Black youth suicide. I am going to just push this a little bit further. And yes, the data does show that for the first time in history, suicide among Black youth and young adults have surpassed whites. But part of that is because of how we define suicide. And when I talk to mental health professionals, I've said, when you talk to some of these Black and brown youth in some of these communities, heavily marginalized communities, you'll notice that they're sometimes reporting these feelings of hopelessness, these feelings of like, I'm not going to live in past 18 or past 21 anyway. And they're reporting sometimes this really high risk behavior that when you think about what they're reporting, they're talking about kind of like this passive suicidal behavior that in these kids, we label it as this kid is probably going to have something happen to them, as opposed to thinking about this kid as somebody who doesn't care if something happens to them. The whole conversation, think about suicide by cop. White person pulls out a gun, they get shot down. People say, oh, that's suicide by cop. Black person pulls out a gun, they get shot by a cop. It's a whole different conversation. It's really kind of thinking a little bit differently about these Black and brown kids may have always been on this suicidal kind of line. But from a cultural standpoint, it's more acceptable for someone to kill you as opposed to taking your own life. Now you're seeing these numbers shift and go in this direction. But those numbers may have already actually reflected Black and brown kids who were on some level suicidal, but were feeling distressed enough to engage in the type of risky behavior where they're not taking their own life, but somebody might take theirs. And I think that's a discussion that we need to continue to have in the mental health field with regards to understanding that some of our kids were taking these high risks, but we didn't identify it as suicide. We identified it as homicidal behavior.
And are you seeing within psychology space for that conversation to be opened up?
Yes, it's starting to. It creates this really kind of, there is a little tension in there, right? Because we don't want to villainize the victim, right? But I always thought it was really interesting that on the flip side, we see white youth as victims and we see Black youth as perpetrators who ended up just being killed first, right? I think that along those lines, right, people are, and they do recognize that when these kids are reporting some of these behaviors, it's because they do feel a sense of powerlessness, right? When you feel a sense of hopelessness, when you feel like, and this is a result, when you're talking about discrimination and racism and all this other stuff, they're like, well, what's in the world for me? Right? Kids learn at a very young age that they get treated differently because of their race, right? So if something happens to them, if they get killed in the street, what happens? Some of them, they get a mural. It's almost like there's a sense of remembrance and legacy that they have through this, because otherwise in the world doesn't see them as somebody who is worthy of love. And this has happened, and you start to feel the power and the weight of discrimination. If you feel powerless and all you have is the little community in front of you, and you start feeling a sense of hopelessness, but you see people being remembered when they get gunned down and they get a mural. What does that say, right? Oh, okay, this is it. It's culturally more acceptable. I'm not going to do it to myself, but if somebody does it to me, if the cops does it to me, there's a sense of remembrance that we can talk and have the dialogue. So sometimes you hurt me, it shines a light on the system.
Well, and I think also I just want to take a little bit more time talking about your focus on kids, on youth, because the impact of trauma is particularly acute when we're thinking about kids. And that's both because kids are at key developmental stages and also because trauma unfolds over the course of people's lives. So there's like a life course dynamic to it. And so how do you think about the urgency of focusing on kids and trauma?
It's extremely important for us to have this conversation with kids at a very young age. What's unfortunate is that we have to have it with them so young. And in some communities, we have to have it so much frequently when they're so young. That's difficult for a parent. I'm a parent. My son is 14 years old. It's almost like, I don't, just maybe to lighten this up a little bit. It's like the movie Terminator, right? Terminator 2, Sarah Connor, right? She knows what's going to happen in the future. And so she's sometimes so caught up in that she doesn't have time to really have fun with her son because she knows Skynet is coming. And that's how sometimes we feel as parents. We're like, your future puts you at risk. As you get older, this is what you're going to have to deal with, because racism is a form of trauma. The fact that there's a huge disparity with regards to who are victims of gun violence. You become Sarah Connor worrying about Skynet as opposed to thinking about sometimes that time you can be having fun with your kid. And sometimes I have to like set it aside and be like, oh, wait. Oh yeah, you're just 14 and you just want to play. As I'm thinking about the work that I'm doing in the gun violence world. And that actually circles me back to a question you asked earlier, which was, how do I also kind of take care of myself? Sometimes it's reminding myself that my son is right here. And I think about, again, the Sarah Connor analogy, Skynet. I'm worried about what he has to worry about in the world. I know what the future holds. So let me try to remember. Let me take you into the pool and throw the football around with you. And I think that's really an important thing, that there's a certain amount of weight that comes along with that. And if I know I might be a little long-winded, but I do a lot of analogies, right? I give a lot of analogies. This one is one that I talk about with people where, it's like if you're outside and you're on the beach, right? And someone says, on the beach, there are these dangerous crabs that come around. They can like get you and it hurts so much. And it's like, yeah, that's right. There's a lot of crabs on this beach who can hurt anybody on this beach. But guess what? For some kids, those crabs will hurt everybody on that beach. But some kids got to worry about what happens to them before they even get to the beach. And that's the kids who are disproportionately affected by it. So when we think about things like mass shootings, like people sometimes will say, oh, there's all of this stuff. Yeah, we got to worry about so many things. I'm like, for some of these Black and brown kids, they got a lot more. They got to worry about that and everything else before they even get into the world. They're worrying about their safety.
So I want to shift to the work that you've done to make an impact beyond the academy. So you are obviously very invested in not just, the research and the analysis that tells us about gun violence, but also impacting policies that do something about gun violence. And so scholars have such a different take on what it means to be publicly impactful. What's your
Yes.
What's your philosophy of public engagement? And I'm also curious, since you're laughing, I'm guessing it might be because of the other part of the part two of the question, which is your approach unique among psychologists?
I'm like, okay, how much time we got?
We have as much time as you have.
My feelings about kind of that impact work is, I think we need to be visible in communities. Is this? I'm sorry to laugh. I'm having like this moment where I actually think one big issue I have is actually with how the funding scheme happens around grants to do research in general.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
Yeah, the whole scheme is problematic in some ways, right? So, I've been involved in, we applied for grants and, you're in that grant funding world and you're working with institutions that trying to pull in grant dollars. And I'm looking at the CDC and I'm like, wow, did they just give away $14 million or something like that? And I might be over exaggerating the number or not. Right? There's millions of dollars. I'll just say 14 million or something like that. I just want to use this point to drive this home, where there's millions of dollars put into research on gun violence in the last 5 or 6 years or something like that. And I'm like, who mostly got that money? Academic institutions, right? Academic institutions. And they get millions of dollars. And the community gets the crumbs. The university says, well, we got to cover the faculty salaries. We got to cover our indirects, right? And how much does the community get? Oh, well, we're going to pay the participants $50 each or $100 each. That's generous, right? To have them come in so you can learn about how gun violence impacts them. There's something a little bit hypocritical about that, because in the grand scheme of things, What do researchers end up finding? Wow, poverty is a really bad indicator because it impacts so many things about this community and then leads to gun violence. So they all talk about in different ways in which poverty essentially impacts communities, which contributes to disparate gun violence outcomes. So universities are getting millions of dollars to do research to find out the different ways that poverty impacts the communities that they're doing the research on. I struggle with that. And again, here I am, a member of the very academy that I loathe, right? While also being in it because I want to do the work. And that's a big issue for me. And I am very outspoken about that. And I think universities and researchers really need to think about that. At least acknowledge it. And I've had conversations where people have said, well, if we give it to the community, we don't know who to give it to. And I was like, well, we give it to universities and look how much has not changed. So clearly there's some privileged dynamic here at play. When it comes to the policy discussion on how much they're actually impacting, that's a big deal in which we need to do better when we think about what impact actually means.
Do you have even just like first steps of an alternative model? What would be your dream vision for how research is done in this area that doesn't get ensnared in all of everything you just laid out?
Man, there's a person I know who's a poet who has this nonprofit called Radical Reversal. His work is actually related to people who are formerly incarcerated or incarcerated. The title captures it all. We need something that's a radical reversal. It wouldn't be a sustainable system for universities, but it would be a damn sustainable, if I may say that, system for communities. Because if, in a perfect world, rather than the academic institutions get the money to then work with the nonprofits in the community, the nonprofits get the money and then get to pick which institutions they want to work with.
And then universities or academics would compete for how can we best serve these nonprofits. Yeah. So it would flip the competitive edge on its head. Yeah.
Flip the competitive edge and put a bunch of us in a room and just mention that and just watch the sparks fly, right? Just wouldn't that be a fun conversation? But I also recognize that academic institutions serve a very important function at the same time. I just think that this system is just far too problematic to not come up with some alternative. And sometimes the alternative is so far on the other extreme, but it at least pulls the dialogue to be like, do you realize what you're actually doing? One step further, because the current system, what happens is that then people turn to the nonprofits and say, well, how do we know what's working? Oh, we don't have the data. The academic institutions has the data. And it's like, how messed up is this?
Yeah. And it sounds like, for you, it's fundamentally just about the funding flows because, obviously many academics, they write about community engaged research. They say they're working with communities, but that funding flow is sort of the bottom line for you.
Right. Yeah. The funding flow is because that's one of the biggest correlates of gun violence is poverty.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
I think that reframing gun violence as a problem of people trying to meet their basic needs, which is something you said earlier, that fundamentally shifts what we're thinking about when we think about gun violence, right? And gun policies and what's on the table in terms of a gun policy. Whereas the criminal justice system has often been the seat of, how gun policy happens in this country. When we think about if gun violence is really a problem of people meeting their basic needs, suddenly that totally shifts. And many other policies that may be explicitly, gun related, but actually not at all explicitly gun related, then come on the table as possibilities for dealing with this issue. And so your dream package of gun policies, what does that look like if we reframe it around the issue of people just trying to meet their basic needs? And I know that's a big question.
Yeah, because I would say actually that my ideal answer to reducing gun violence is to reduce access to guns. I definitely can't move away from that, right? But when it comes to everything else, I think that I've had conversations in the community and with policymakers about putting more resources into communities. And when I say more resources, I mean jobs, I mean green space, right? I mean access to transportation, reliable transportation, giving people livable wages, almost like gentrification without displacement. People say, well, if we want to reduce the amount of poverty in the community and put more resources into it, I said, you all currently do that. It's called gentrification, right? And you just move everybody out. Try that, but not move everybody out, right? Give people opportunities to be able to fund themselves through better jobs, through reliable transportation to get to their jobs, right? Make the Department of Transportation also sit at this table. Let's bring some of these corporations who actually may have some sense of social responsibility that are willing to train people in the community through whether it's internships, paid internships. That would be a great idea, right? We could put youth through a pipeline that's connected through schools and where they can get internships at these local companies to where they're actually building the talent in the community and then allowing them to have jobs. And I think that would be kind of like my ideal. I've had people say, well, Kendell, that sounds great, but we can't end poverty. And I say, but you do. I mean, or at least you reduce it when you bring people in and you move everybody out. And they said, well, yeah, that's private dollars. And it's like, yeah, but the city finds a way to get those private dollars when they want to clean up a community, right? They're like, okay, that's a good point, right? It's like, yeah, it just goes to show where our priorities are. And so I think a model that looks like that, because I hear people say, well, we're going to try to have a job enhancement program. And it's like, okay, but are people going to have livable wages? Are they going to be able to get to their jobs, right? I mean, and if you can't bring people like the Department of Transportation and the people from the city, the planners to the table to make jobs accessible, you've just put a Band-Aid on something, but you didn't stop the bleeding.
And also thinking holistically, I'm wondering if there are cautionary tales you can share with us, policies that seem compelling on the surface, but are actually either not so effective or even detrimental when we actually see how they play out.
A good example is the way that they will say that we're trying to increase jobs. That on the surface, it always sounds like a great idea. But then when you ask them, well, who are the potential employers? They're like, oh, well, some of the potential employers aren't even obligated to hire these individuals. I'm like, there's some, what do I want to call it? Bait and switch here. It's like, oh, this one. But then when you go there, they're not actually willing to hire them because they can always use these smokescreen reasons for not hiring the person. So really thinking about people as valuable individuals as opposed to something you think you could just slot them in to just buy your time and just hope the numbers go down. Probably while they're also gentrifying the neighborhood and moving them out.
So Connecticut, where you are, is a really interesting place for thinking about gun policy. After Sandy Hook, there's been a lot of movement in the gun violence space. And obviously, you have Senator Chris Murphy, who is pushing for gun policy reform at the federal level. And so the policy terrain seems like it's definitely shifting in some spaces, and Connecticut would definitely be one of those spaces. And so I'm curious what comes to top of mind in terms of policy changes that you've seen in Connecticut or even at the local level that you see as particularly positive, and where you find hope and encouragement in this work.
I am happy that they're really trying to lock down, kind of creating tighter laws around gun ownership, as well as ghost guns and trying to be tighter on those. I think those are all really great ideas. Safe storage, I think, is a really wonderful idea. I do think when it comes to safe storage, so Connecticut has really tight laws around requiring people to store their firearms, which is I think very helpful to reduce accidental injuries. We have a harder time though with safe storage in a city and urban communities. We do have a harder time with that for a lot of different reasons, right? Again, I really want us to try to figure out how to do that in more diverse areas as well effectively. That's a longer road. Also, red flag laws, right? Where if we think someone may be a danger to self or others, right? Law enforcement, they can confiscate their guns. A family member can petition to have the person's firearms taken away. And there's pushback on that, right? But I also think that that's a step in the right direction as well. I appreciate the amount of funding that's also going into communities I think, to fund violence intervention programs as well, community organizations to help them do the work in their local communities. I think that's all great. So I do admire a lot of the work that the state of Connecticut is doing. Again, I just want us to figure out how to make sure that money is going into the community, because true prevention is not late intervention, right? It's on the front end.
So, unfortunately, we are rapidly running out of time. This has been so fascinating. I have two final questions for you. The first question is, what do we need to be asking about gun violence that we aren't?
I think we need to do a better job with going to the people who do it and asking them, what do you need? What would you need for you, and to help other people who are like you, who are potentially doing this, who are thinking about doing this? What do you need from us? What is it that you need? As opposed to asking everybody else to figure out what it is that they need. I think that is huge. Right? Just go to the source. And generally it's the criminal justice response, right? But we now know, and we've long known, that harsher punishment, stiffer penalties is not necessarily a deterrent. And especially if you're thinking about, okay, how am I going to get my next meal on this table? How am I going to get my next meal to feed my family? Well, deterrence is not probably going to work very well, right? So I think asking them, there should be accountability. I am not someone who does not believe there should not be accountability. I've been on the other side of that. I've lost friends to gun violence. Do I want those people to be held accountable? Absolutely. But I also want us to be doing things to prevent another family from feeling that pain. And if that means talking to people who are out there and getting, look, what can we do? Whether that's coming from the community. I'm tired of asking academics. Oh, I'm sorry. I think that may have, I'm an academic. But once again, right, I'm a member of that same academy. What should we be doing? I'm like, let's ask them. And I want to tell academics to do that. I've long said, go to the community. And academics have said, yeah, but we probably can't talk to them. You know what? People who live in the community, I'm somebody who did. We know who they are. we know exactly. I can get you on the phone with them as long as they know they're not going to prison right now by these questions. And by the way, as I'm going off, I'm not telling you, hey, you go ask them. I'm talking about the
Well, maybe a
one.
listener, maybe someone who is thinking about
Right.
entering into this kind of research. Yeah. So
Yes,
maybe you are
yes.
telling. Yeah. Yeah. So on that point, I'm going to ask my final question, which is actually a request for a homework assignment, which is, what are you reading now and what should we be reading after this conversation, after we've, yeah.
You know, what's very interesting, as I was thinking about, as you were saying that, I sit in front of the TV and watch like Netflix shows and Amazon Prime and stuff like that. But the reason why I do that is because it's for my self-care, right? So I do read stuff, but for me, I think because I talk to and I'm in the community so much, I spend my time reading about stuff that just makes me laugh and smile.
I think that's a perfect homework assignment for the end of this conversation. Find something that makes you laugh and smile. I just want to say thank you so much. I have learned so much from reading your work, but even more from talking to you. This has been a brilliant conversation. Thank you so much. Dr. Kendell Coker of Connecticut College, thank you so much for joining us today on Guns Unpacked.
And I don't know if I can kind of just make a somewhat of a shameless plug here.
Absolutely. Throw it
Okay,
in.
thank you. So I'm also the co-editor of the American Journal for Orthopsychiatry. Don't love the name. The name predated me by 100 years or something like that. But we are one of the premier social justice journals for the American Psychological Association. And I was just talking to some of my colleagues about how I want to see more manuscripts submitted to us about gun violence prevention, things that people are doing in the gun violence world, research wise, that's benefiting communities. So if anybody out there is doing this type of work where it's something around firearm violence that's really for the benefit of the community through a behavioral health or social justice lens, please send those manuscripts to me. I want to see them. And again, it's with the American Journal of Orthopsychiatry, AJO.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And we will be sure to put the journal information in the write-up about the podcast episode so listeners can access all of that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. This has been Guns Unpacked, and I've been your host, Jennifer Carlson, the director of the Center for the Study of Guns in Society at Arizona State University. You can learn more about our center and all we do at csgs.asu.edu. Music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. This episode was produced by Regina Ravazova.